Let's welcome our President, Mr. Ishiwata, with a big hand. Mr. Ishiwata.
It was in the summer of 1963 that Dr. Martin Luther King delivered this speech in the shadow of Lincoln's statue. It was the 100-year anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the law that Lincoln had signed to free slaves. But even 100 years after the abolition of slavery, African Americans were segregated, discriminated, and not given human rights. They were not given a chance to work, study in the place they wanted. They were not allowed to go to restaurants, schools, where the white people went. And if they did, they could have been arrested, sent to jail, or in the worst case, they might have been killed. Even when they were among themselves, just praying at their own church, they faced the fear of being bombed and murdered. The situation was horrible, but they did not lose courage. Courage to stand up, speak up, and work together peacefully in order for them to make America a better country. And that is why the unprecedented number of people gathered together in Washington, D.C. on that scorching day in August, and facing 200,000 people, Dr. King eloquently described their discontent, disappointment, despair, and anger. And he demanded that America change urgently. And at the same time, he insisted that his people keep dignity and discipline. And with high moral standards, they continue their nonviolent movement. And then, in his speech, he shared something that really touched the heart of everyone listening. He shared his dreams. He was able to envision a bright future because he trusted in the power of people, that it can bring peace and freedom for all mankind. With this faith, he said, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. His message was, even when the situation is difficult, so difficult that we cannot be certain about tomorrow, we will always be able to find hope if we join forces for the right cause. His words are so encouraging that I believe they can give us, the people in Japan now facing devastating consequences of both natural and human disasters, hope, dreams, and determination and energy to rebuild our nation. And so, I would humbly like to recite his speech for us today. But before I do, may I ask for a moment of silence for the victims of the Tohoku disasters. Thank you very much, everybody. Now, ladies and gentlemen, here is Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech in its entirety. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end a long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself an exile in his own land. So we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as a white man, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color were concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. So we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us, upon demand, the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunny path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It will be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summer of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and would now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. And there we neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But there is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining a rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protest to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back.